He had never thought much about parking before that day. It was just another normal morning, the kind where life felt routine and predictable. He woke up early, made a simple breakfast, and checked his phone for work messages. His job depended on being on time. One missed day could mean lost trust, and lost trust could mean lost income. So he moved quickly, trying not to waste a single minute. Outside, the street looked calm. The same small shops, the same old trees, and the same row of cars lined up along the curb. He parked his car in the same spot he had used many times before. There was no clear sign saying he could not park there. No painted curb. No warning notice. Just a normal street that people used every day. He locked the car, took one last look to be sure he wasn't blocking anything, and walked away without worry. At that moment, he had no idea that this simple action would turn into a problem that would change his entire week by midday. His phone started buzzing nonstop. He was in the middle of work when a coworker leaned over and asked if he had moved his car. He felt confused. He hadn't. He stepped outside, his heart suddenly beating faster. The place where his car should have been was empty. At first he thought maybe he had parked on the wrong street. He walked up and down, checking every corner. Nothing. His car was gone. That sinking feeling hit him hard. It wasn't just about the car. It was about how much he depended on it. It was his only way to get to work, to buy groceries, to take care of family matters. Losing it, even for a few hours, felt like the ground had dropped under his feet. He called the local police number, his hands shaking slightly. After giving the details, he was told his car had been towed. The reason given was unauthorized parking. Unauthorized. That word stayed in his head. He asked where it had been taken and how he could get it back. The answer came quickly, almost too quickly, as if they had given it many times before. A towing yard across town. Fees already adding up by the hour. When he arrived at the towing yard, the place felt cold and unwelcoming. Cars were packed tightly together like forgotten objects. At the small office window, a board worker slid a paper toward him with the total amount owed. The number was far higher than he expected. He tried to explain. He spoke calmly, pointing out that there were no signs and no warnings. The worker shrugged and said he was just doing his job. If there was a problem, he should talk to the person who called it in. That was the first time he heard about her. The worker mentioned a woman from the neighborhood who managed things. Someone who made calls when she didn't like how things looked. Someone who believed the street belonged to her. He paid the fee because he had no choice. Every minute wasted meant more trouble for his life. As he drove away, anger sat quietly inside him, not loud or explosive, but heavy. Later that evening, he returned to the street where it all started. He looked again for signs. Still nothing. No legal notice. No clear markings. Just a quiet neighborhood acting like nothing had happened. That's when he saw her. She stood near the sidewalk, speaking loudly, on her phone, pointing at cars as they passed. Her body language was sharp, confident, and dismissive. She carried herself like someone who expected to be obeyed. He approached her carefully. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse her. He simply asked if she knew why his car had been towed. She looked him up and down before answering. Her tone was cold. She said the street had rules and that people like him needed to learn them. When he asked what rules, she laughed and said she didn't have time to explain basic things. He tried again. He told her there were no signs. He told her the tow had cost him a lot of money. He told her he just wanted clarity. Her response was short and cutting. She said if he didn't like it, he shouldn't park there. Then she turned away, already dialing her phone again, as if he no longer existed. People nearby had noticed. A few watched quietly. No one stepped in. Some looked away, afraid to get involved. Others seemed used to this kind of behavior. That walk back to his car felt longer than usual. His mind replayed the conversation again and again. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about respect, about fairness, about how easily someone with confidence and connections could make life harder for others. That night, he barely slept. He kept thinking about how quickly things had escalated from a simple parking job to a costly problem. He thought about how many other people might have gone through the same thing but stayed silent the next morning. Instead of letting anger control him, he did something different. He sat down with his laptop and started reading. Parking laws, city codes, towing regulations. He wasn't a lawyer, but he knew how to learn. What he found surprised him. In his city, towing without clear signage was often illegal. Complaints had to follow a process. Calls had to be documented. Permits had to be current. The more he read, the more questions he had. He realized that the woman's confidence might not come from being right, but from believing no one would challenge her. People like her often counted on others being too tired, too busy, or too scared to fight back. He wasn't scared. Not anymore, but he also wasn't reckless. He understood that reacting emotionally would only make things worse. He needed facts, proof, patience. Over the next few days, he spoke to neighbors quietly. Some hesitated at first, but once he explained what happened, stories began to come out. Cars towed early in the morning, arguments on the sidewalk, threats made casually as if they were normal. Many felt powerless. They believed nothing could be done. He listened more than he spoke. Every story added another piece to the picture forming in his mind. This wasn't a one-time incident. It was a pattern. One evening, as he stood by his car and looked down the street, he felt something shift inside him. He understood that this was bigger than him. Bigger than one tow? He didn't want revenge. He didn't want to embarrass anyone. What he wanted was balance. A reminder that rules applied to everyone, not just the quiet ones. As he drove home, he made a decision. He would not let this go. But he would do it the right way. Calm, legal, unexpected. At that moment, he had no idea how far things would go. He didn't know that a single tow would lead to paperwork, permits, public attention, and something so unusual that people would talk about it for years. All he knew was this. Someone had crossed a line, and he was no longer willing to step back. And that was only the beginning. He spent the next morning staring at his computer screen, the glow of the monitor reflecting in his tired eyes. The previous incident was still fresh, but now he needed more than just anger. He needed understanding. He needed to know exactly how the towing had happened and why no one had stopped it. He started by going through city parking codes, regulations about private towing, and permits for public streets. Every page he read seemed to confirm what he suspected. Something about the way his car had been taken didn't add up. He learned that towing companies were required to clearly post notices and follow certain procedures. There were specific signs, warnings, and records they had to maintain. If those steps weren't followed, the tow could be challenged legally. The more he read, the more he realized that what had happened to him wasn't just unfair, might actually have been illegal. He decided to go further. He visited the city's public records, his office, to look for information about the towing company and the woman who had called them. The process was slow, full of forms and paperwork, but he was patient. He went through city permits, zoning laws, and past complaints. He discovered that the towing company had been cited several times before for mistakes in documentation. Some of these mistakes had cost car owners hundreds, even thousands, of dollars in fines and fees. He also found records connected to the woman. She had made several complaints in the past, each resulting in towing, fines, or warnings for neighbors. Most of these cases were small and never challenged because the people involved either didn't know their rights or were too intimidated to act. Her reputation in the neighborhood was strong. She carried herself like someone who was untouchable. And for a while, it seemed like no one dared to question her. He started talking to neighbors quietly. At first, they were hesitant, shaking their heads and saying they didn't want to get involved. But he didn't give up. He explained what had happened to him, showed some of the public records he had found, and shared the legal details. Slowly, a few neighbors opened up. They told him about cars being towed for small mistakes, like a wheel slightly over the curb or a temporary visitor parking there. Some described encounters where the woman had shouted at them, called the police, or threatened legal action. Each story added to the pattern he was seeing. This wasn't a single mistake or an isolated incident. It was repeated behavior. One afternoon, he met with a neighbor who had been particularly vocal about the woman's actions. She told him that she had once challenged a towing in court, only to be intimidated into dropping the case. She shared photos, receipts, and even a few emails that documented her attempt. It was clear that the woman had a habit of using her influence and confidence to avoid consequences. He realized that he needed more than stories and evidence from neighbors. He needed official documentation that could hold up if he chose to take legal action. He spent the next several days visiting offices, requesting records, and filing formal complaints. It was exhausting and often frustrating. Some clerks were unhelpful, others dismissive, but he kept calm. He knew that rushing or getting angry would only harm his case. During this process, he also began to map out the street and surrounding area. He noted the locations of signs, driveways, fire hydrants, and other potential obstacles. Everything he documented could be used to show that his car had been parked legally and that the tow had been unnecessary. He even measured distances and angles to make sure he could prove that nothing had been obstructed. While gathering this information, he also realized how important patience was. Every day he learned something new. He discovered that the towing company had agreements with several neighborhoods, that the woman had influence over more than just her street. People were afraid to speak up because she had made examples of others. He understood that her power came from intimidation and from others' silence. One evening, as he reviewed all the records he had collected, he felt a sense of clarity. He could see the full picture now. A woman who abused her influence, a towing company that often cut corners, and a city system that allowed this behavior to continue unchecked. He had proof, witnesses, and the law on his side, but he didn't want to confront her directly yet. He knew that doing so without a plan could backfire. Instead, he began thinking creatively. He considered what tools and resources he had at his disposal. He thought about his work, his connections, and his ability to transport heavy machinery. Ideas started forming in his mind not for revenge in the personal sense, but for a surprising, lawful way to make her realize the consequences of her actions. He continued to talk to neighbors discreetly. Some were cautious, worried about retaliation. Others were quietly supportive, relieved to know someone was finally investigating. He realized that he wasn't just building a case for himself. He was also giving others courage to stand up. During this time, he also started documenting every phone call, every email, and every small interaction. He knew that details mattered, and that a well-documented history could make the difference in holding the woman accountable. He kept notes in a notebook, filed them by date, and cross-referenced them with public records. As the days went by, he began to feel a sense of control he hadn't felt before. The initial shock and anger had faded into a focused determination. He was no longer just a victim. He was someone preparing for action. But this action wouldn't be impulsive. It would be precise, lawful, and clever. Late one night, as he reviewed everything he had gathered, he thought about the woman again. He imagined how she would react if the city started investigating her actions more closely. He imagined the surprise and the panic if people finally saw the full record of her behavior. The thought gave him a quiet satisfaction, a sense that justice didn't have to be loud or violent. It could be firm and undeniable. At the same time, he remained grounded. He reminded himself that the goal wasn't humiliation or revenge. It was accountability. It was ensuring that the rules applied equally to everyone, not just those bold enough to bend them. He wanted fairness, and he was willing to work for it patiently. By the end of the second week, he had a detailed folder of evidence. Emails, photographs, measurements, public records, and testimonies from neighbors filled it. He had also spoken to a local lawyer, just to understand what steps he could legally take if necessary. The lawyer confirmed what he had already suspected. He had a strong position. The man felt a mixture of relief and anticipation. Relief that he had clarity and proof, anticipation for the steps he could take next. He understood that the coming days would require careful planning, patience, and restraint. But he was ready. For the first time since the car was towed, he felt calm. The panic, The helplessness and the anger had shifted into something stronger, a sense of purpose. He knew that when the time came, he would act in a way that was unexpected, lawful, and impossible to ignore. And deep down, he also knew that this was only the beginning. The woman's confidence, built on fear and silence, would soon meet someone who had facts, patience, and the law on his side. It was quiet outside, but in his mind everything was moving. Every record, every story, and every note was a step toward balance. And that balance, he decided, would be delivered in a way she could not ignore. This was the work of patience, of investigation, and of careful strategy. And though he could not yet see the outcome, he felt a quiet certainty that things would change. The street would no longer belong to fear. The towing company would no longer act unchecked. And the woman, who had believed herself untouchable, would soon learn that her confidence was not stronger than the truth. He closed his laptop that night, stretched his stiff shoulders, and stepped outside for a moment. The neighborhood was quiet, almost peaceful, with only the faint hum of cars in the distance. He took a deep breath and looked at the street. It felt different now. Not because anything had changed yet, but because he had changed. He was no longer a victim, waiting for chance. He was someone prepared to act, calmly and wisely. Using knowledge and the law as his tools, the investigation had given him power, but it had also given him clarity. He knew exactly what needed to happen next, and when that moment came, it would not be dramatic in the way she expected. It would be undeniable, lawful, and impossible to ignore. And as he turned back toward his house, he smiled faintly to himself, knowing that the quiet patience of preparation was already beginning to work in ways she could not yet imagine. He spent the next few days thinking carefully about what to do. He wanted to respond, but not in anger. He wanted the lesson to be clear, but also legal. He remembered the work he did with large vehicles and machinery for his job. He transported heavy equipment, including some old, decommissioned military vehicles, for museums and restoration projects. It wasn't something everyone could do. It wasn't something most people even knew about. One night, while reviewing his notes and evidence, an idea formed. He realized that he could arrange for one of the vehicles he transported a massive 30-ton tank to be delivered nearby in a way that was completely legal. It would be a spectacle, and it would force people, including the woman who had caused so much trouble, to pay attention. But it wouldn't be dangerous or violent. It would be lawful, and it would make a point that no one could ignore. He started by checking permits. The city had rules for oversized vehicle transport, and every permit had to be precise. He contacted the local authorities and explained that he would be transporting a historical military vehicle for an approved museum display. He described the route, the timing, and the staging location. After a few back-and-forth calls, the permits were approved. The location where he could legally stage the delivery happened to be a vacant lot in the woman's neighborhood. It was perfect. Public, legal, and impossible to ignore. The day before the delivery, he made final preparations. He inspected the vehicle and the transport truck, making sure every safety measure was in place. He confirmed all permits, notified city authorities, and double-checked insurance requirements. Every detail had to be correct. He didn't want this to be seen as a stunt. It had to be above board. That night, he barely slept. Not because he was anxious, but because he was excited. This was the moment where all his research, all his patience, and all his careful planning would meet the real world. The woman had acted as if she could control the street. Now, she would see that rules applied to everyone. Even her early in the morning, the transport truck arrived at the staging area. Police escorts followed to ensure safety and compliance with traffic laws. Onlookers began to gather as they noticed a massive flatbed moving slowly down the street. People stopped their cars, stepped out of shops, and stared at the enormous vehicle. Some whispered. Some took out their phones. No one could ignore it. He arrived shortly after, calm but focused. As the tank was carefully unloaded onto the lot, neighbors gathered closer. The woman was there, of course, her confident posture unchanged at first. But as she realized what was happening, her expression shifted. Her smile faltered, replaced by surprise and confusion. She didn't immediately understand what this meant, but she knew it was connected to her. He watched quietly as the crowd grew. People whispered, pointing out the details, the massive size, the legal permits displayed prominently, the police presence. The spectacle was undeniable, and it was completely legal. No one could accuse him of wrongdoing. He didn't speak to her yet. He didn't need to. The moment itself was the message. The patience, preparation, and legality of the delivery spoke louder than words ever could. City inspectors arrived shortly after to check the permits in the staging area. While reviewing the paperwork, they also noted several irregularities around the woman's property in the neighborhood. Improper signs, incorrect permit usage, and records of previous towing complaints all came to light. The tank delivery, seemingly unrelated, had drawn attention to her behavior. Neighbors who had previously stayed silent began speaking up quietly. They shared stories of past incidents, recounting times when cars were towed or warnings were issued unnecessarily. Some admitted they had been too afraid to challenge her. Now, with so many witnesses and the city present, the atmosphere shifted. People were no longer silent. They were empowered by the legality and boldness of the display. Throughout the day, the woman tried to regain control. She spoke loudly, pointing fingers and trying to assert authority, but her words fell flat. No one listened the way they once had. The legal presence of authorities and the overwhelming attention of the neighbors left her with little room to maneuver. The man walked calmly around the tank, observing the scene. He didn't need to gloat. He didn't need to shout. The law, preparation, and the sheer surprise of the situation did the work for him. He was a quiet force in the middle of chaos, showing that preparation and patience could be far more effective than anger or threats. By evening, the tank remained on the lot under proper supervision. News crews had begun taking interest, photographing the scene and asking questions about the delivery. The woman, once confident in her unchecked influence, now had to face scrutiny. She had underestimated the impact of someone acting within the law, but in a way she had not anticipated. The man left that evening feeling a mix of satisfaction and relief. The tank would be there for a few more days before being moved to its final destination, but the point had been made. The street was no longer hers to control. People had seen what could happen when someone acted calmly, legally, and with careful planning as he drove home. He thought about the lessons of the day. Confidence built on fear and silence could only last so long. When patience, law, and preparation were combined, even the most seemingly untouchable person could be challenged. He smiled quietly to himself, knowing that the next steps would build on this moment, strengthening the impact and ensuring that fairness prevailed. For the first time since his car had been towed, he felt a sense of empowerment. He hadn't needed anger or revenge. He had needed patience, preparation, and a clever legal plan. And it had worked. The neighborhood, once quiet and fearful, was now paying attention. He knew the woman would not forget this day. Her authority had been challenged in a way she could neither ignore nor reverse. But more importantly, he had shown himself and the neighbors that rules applied to everyone, and that careful. Lawful action could restore balance without a single moment of aggression. As night fell, the streets returned to their normal rhythm, but the story had changed. People would talk about the day the tank arrived, and the woman's confidence had been tempered by the reality of accountability. The man, meanwhile, planned the final moves. The tank was only part of the story. The next steps would ensure that fairness and order prevailed fully, quietly and irrevocably. He closed his eyes that night, thinking about the future. The investigation, the planning, and the legal delivery had all worked. But he knew the situation wasn't over. There were still small steps to take, small adjustments to make, and final resolutions to achieve. The patience and preparation that had brought him this far would guide him to the end. And with that certainty, he drifted off to sleep, ready for whatever came next. The morning arrived quietly, but the neighborhood was anything but calm. By the time the man stepped outside, people were already gathering near the lot where the tank had been staged. It was no longer just a curiosity. It had become a spectacle. Children pointed from the sidewalks, neighbors whispered among themselves, and a few cars slowed to watch the enormous vehicle sitting there. Silent but impossible to ignore, news crews had arrived early, cameras rolling, microphones ready. They were drawn by the unusual scene and the sheer size of the tank. People passing by stopped and asked questions, some curious, some confused. The man knew exactly what would happen next. The tank itself was impressive. But what would truly capture attention was the story behind it. As the day progressed, the woman appeared again. Her confidence was visible at first, but it wavered as she noticed the growing crowd and the presence of officials and news crews. She tried to approach the scene, speaking loudly to anyone who would listen. She claimed the delivery was dangerous, claimed it was unnecessary, and claimed she had authority over the street. But this time, no one listened. Neighbors who had once followed her instructions now stood quietly but firmly, watching, whispering, taking notes, and recording the scene with their phones. City inspectors, who had been monitoring the tank delivery, arrived at the lot. They reviewed permits carefully, double-checking measurements, timing, and safety precautions. Everything was correct. The delivery was completely legal, fully documented, and approved by authorities. The presence of the inspectors added weight to the situation. The woman could no longer assert her influence without being challenged by official records and city regulations. As the inspectors conducted their checks, they began to notice other issues. Improper signage, incorrect permits, and records of multiple towing complaints related to the woman's influence surfaced. It became clear that she had a pattern of controlling the neighborhood by calling for towing and imposing fines. Often in situations where residents had not actually broken any rules, the inspectors documented everything carefully. Every misstep, every violation, every record of harassment became part of the official report. The man stayed quiet in the background, observing everything. He did not need to confront the woman directly. The combination of the tank, the permits, the crowd, and the city inspectors was already telling the story. People around him began to murmur about past incidents, sharing their own experiences of being targeted, of being fined unfairly, or of being threatened. The pattern of behavior that had seemed untouchable for so long was now coming into full view. The woman tried to regain control by speaking directly to the inspectors, but her words carried less weight. Every claim she made was met with questions about documentation, permits, and evidence. The inspectors were thorough, and they did not allow personal opinions or past influence to interfere with their review. She became frustrated, her confident posture faltering as she realized that the law and the public attention were no longer in her favor. The crowd continued to grow. Neighbors who had been silent for years now felt empowered. They pointed out issues with her actions, shared stories of their cars being towed, spoke about how she had intimidated others. Their voices, combined with the city inspector's authority, created a force that could not be ignored. The woman's influence, which had relied on fear and secrecy, began to crumble under the weight of public attention and lawful scrutiny. Meanwhile, the man walked around the tank, making sure everything remained orderly. He spoke quietly to city officials when necessary, providing documentation and explanations, but he avoided any confrontation with the woman. He understood that this was not about personal revenge. It was about fairness, accountability, and showing that the rules applied to everyone. The spectacle of the tank, combined with the legal attention and community support, made that point more powerfully than any argument could. By midday, the news coverage had grown. Reporters interviewed neighbors, city inspectors, and the man himself. They asked questions about the legality of the delivery, the history of the neighborhood, and the impact of the woman's actions. The man answered calmly, explaining that the delivery was part of a legal museum project and emphasizing that it highlighted the importance of following rules and regulations fairly. His calm, rational explanation stood in stark contrast to the woman's increasingly panicked attempts to assert control as the day wore on. City officials began issuing warnings and notices related to the woman's past violations. Improper towing practices, incorrect signage, and harassment complaints were all documented. These official notices were public. Neighbors began to see that the authority she had once wielded so confidently was not absolute. The power she had relied on for years had limits, and those limits were now clearly visible. The man continued to act as a quiet observer. He did not need to celebrate or draw attention to himself. The combination of the tank, the crowd, the news coverage, and the official scrutiny was already making the impact he had planned. Neighbors were taking photos, recording videos, and sharing the story online. The woman's reputation, once built on fear, began to weaken in real time. As evening approached, the tank remained in the lot, fully supervised by city authorities and museum personnel. The woman retreated to her property, frustrated and powerless. The crowd slowly dispersed, but the effect of the day lingered. People talked about what they had seen, shared stories with friends and family, and began to question the unchecked authority she had held for so long. The man walked home quietly, reflecting on the day. The spectacle of the tank had drawn attention, but the real change had come from preparation, patience, and legality. He had not broken any laws, threatened anyone, or acted recklessly. Yet he had created a situation where fairness and accountability could no longer be ignored. That night, the neighborhood felt different. People were quieter, but more confident. They had witnessed a powerful reminder that rules applied to everyone, and that authority built on fear could be challenged. The woman, once untouchable in her mind, has been forced to confront a reality she had not anticipated. The man sat at home, reviewing the events of the day. He knew that the work was not yet complete. The next steps would involve following through with legal documentation and ensuring that the woman faced the proper consequences for her actions. But for the first time, he felt a sense of balance returning to the street. He understood that true impact came from careful planning, patience, and lawful action. The tank had been a symbol, yes, but the real power had been in preparation, evidence, and the courage of the community to speak up. He felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that he had not only addressed his own situation, but had also given others courage to challenge unfair practices. As he looked out his window that night, he knew that the neighborhood would never be the same. The day's events had created a ripple effect. People would talk about it for weeks, months, maybe even years. The woman's influence had been checked, her power diminished, and fairness had been restored. He closed his eyes, confident that the final steps would solidify the change. The tank had made its point, but the story was not over. There was still paperwork to file, follow-ups with city officials, and a need to ensure that the lessons of the day were not forgotten. And with that quiet determination, he prepared for the next phase, knowing that patience, legality, and careful strategy would see the situation through to a proper conclusion. The next morning, the neighborhood was quieter than usual. People were still talking about the tank delivery from the day before, whispering as they walked down the streets, pointing at small details they had noticed, and shaking their heads at the woman's reactions. Word had spread quickly, and even neighbors who had previously stayed completely out of these matters now felt a small spark of hope. Something had changed. The man woke early, as usual. He did not feel triumphant or boastful. Instead, he felt focused. He had come this far by staying calm, collecting evidence, and acting lawfully. Now, it was time to ensure that the full consequences of the woman's behavior were realized. He spent the morning checking in with city officials, confirming that all the documentation of her violations had been properly filed. Everything was in order, and the inspectors confirmed that further action could be taken by mid-morning. Letters and notices were arriving at the woman's home. These were official communications from the city, highlighting past violations, improper towing complaints, the consequences of ignoring regulations. The man watched from a distance, quietly observing the effect. The woman paced back and forth, her earlier confidence replaced with agitation. She glanced at the tank still on the lot, realizing how public her situation had become. Every neighbor, every passerby, and every news camera had now witnessed her influence crumble. Neighbors began stepping forward with their own accounts, adding their voices to the city's investigations. They shared details about minor harassment, false claims about parking violations, and intimidation that had been used to control the street for years. Each story reinforced the pattern of behavior and made it impossible for city authorities to ignore. The man made sure all testimony was documented carefully. He knew that fairness depended not just on a spectacle, but on accurate records and lawful procedures. The woman attempted to regain control, approaching inspectors and even city officials with claims that she had authority over certain parts of the neighborhood. However, each of her assertions was met with calm questions, requests for documentation, and references to city codes. Her authority, once absolute in the minds of neighbors, was now being tested against the law itself. Slowly it became clear that she had no legal ground. The man spent the day moving carefully among neighbors and officials, answering questions when needed, providing records, and maintaining a quiet presence. He did not speak directly to the woman except when required, and even then he kept his tone calm and professional. His patience, evidence, and careful planning were doing the work he had intended. By late afternoon, the city had begun issuing fines and corrective orders. The woman's towing privileges were temporarily suspended until she complied with all proper regulations. Improper signage was required to be corrected, and she was formally warned that any future misuse of towing authority would result in more serious legal consequences. The neighborhood had never seen such accountability applied to her before, and the effect was immediate. People began to whisper about how things might finally be different. The tank, still under supervision, had become a symbol of change. People gathered, not in fear, but in curiosity and conversation. Children ran around, neighbors exchanged stories, and everyone seemed aware that the balance of power had shifted. No one needed to shout or fight. The legality and careful planning of the man's actions spoke louder than any argument. By evening, the woman was noticeably quieter. She stayed mostly inside her home, occasionally stepping out to check on the tank or glance at the neighbors. Her previous air of dominance had faded, replaced with caution and calculation. She was no longer the untouchable figure she had once believed herself to be. The man, meanwhile, remained calm. He had no desire to humiliate her publicly. His goal had never been revenge for its own sake. It had been fairness, accountability, and respect for the law. The tank had drawn attention, but the real impact came from the combination of evidence, preparation, and lawful action. The woman had been forced to confront the consequences of her behavior without anyone being hurt, threatened, or endangered. Neighbors began to express their gratitude quietly. Some came to speak to him directly, others left notes of thanks or offered small gestures of kindness. It was clear that his actions had restored more than just his own car or reputation. They had restored faith in fairness and accountability for an entire community. The city inspectors returned the following day to finalize the process. They reviewed the situation thoroughly, ensuring that all proper measures had been taken and that the woman had been formally notified of her violations and obligations. The process was official, and the man documented everything carefully. By this point, the woman had no room to maneuver. All legal avenues had been accounted for, and the community had witnessed the consequences firsthand. Finally, the day arrived when the tank could be safely moved to its intended destination, a museum project several miles away. The transport was carefully managed, fully permitted, and accompanied by city officials. Neighbors gathered one last time to watch, taking photos and quietly acknowledging the end of the spectacle. The woman remained at home, unable to confront or interfere as the tank moved away. The neighborhood began to feel normal again, but it was a new kind of normal. People spoke freely without fear. Neighbors greeted one another without hesitation. And the quiet understanding that the woman's unchecked authority had ended lingered in the air. The man walked home slowly, reflecting on everything that had happened. He felt satisfaction, but it was quiet and grounded. He had not needed to act out of anger. He had used patience, research, and lawful action to achieve a result that no shouting, fighting, or threats could have produced. Over the next few days, the woman complied with city orders. She corrected signage, followed proper towing procedures, and avoided any further harassment of neighbors. Her influence had been checked, and she had been reminded that authority carried responsibility. The community had learned a lesson in fairness, accountability, and the power of calm, lawful action. The man continued to document everything, keeping records in case anything else arose in the future. He didn't need to celebrate. The results spoke for themselves. The towing company no longer had permission to operate in the neighborhood without scrutiny. Neighbors felt empowered, and the woman had learned that her confidence could not override rules or community rights. As he looked around the streets one evening, he felt a quiet pride, not in revenge, not in spectacle, but in fairness. He had turned a personal grievance into a lesson for the community without hurting anyone, breaking any laws, or escalating conflict. The balance had been restored. People could finally live without fear of arbitrary authority. He smiled faintly as he walked back to his home, thinking about how important patience, preparation, and lawful action were. The tank had been the beginning, a symbol, but the real work had been careful planning, research, and strategy. He had shown that even the most confident and intimidating people could be challenged, not with anger, but with reason and law. By the end of the week, the neighborhood had returned to a peaceful rhythm. Life moved on, but the story of the tank and the lessons it represented stayed with people. Conversation shifted, authority was questioned respectfully, and neighbors felt empowered to speak up when something seemed unfair.